All right, y'all, welcome to the Scott Horton Show. I'm the director of the Libertarian Institute, editorial director of antiwar.com, author of the book Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan, and the brand new Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism. And I've recorded more than 5,500 interviews since 2003, almost all on foreign policy, and all available for you at scotthorton.org. You can sign up for the podcast feed there, and the full interview archive is also available at youtube.com/Scott Horton Show. Hey guys, on the line, I've got the great Grant F. Smith. He is the director of the Institute for Research, Middle Eastern Policy, IRMEP, IRMEP. And that's IRMEP.org. And he's written a bunch of great books about the Israel lobby's influence in the United States, including their illegal shenanigans, including their stealing weapons-grade uranium from America and the rest. And he's got this great new podcast, which is essentially the audio book of America's Defense Line, or which one of these was it? Anyway.
Yeah, that's America's Defense Line, yeah. plus some bonus content.
Oh, great. So the masterpiece book is Big Israel. Get it, like Big Tobacco or that kind of thing, right? So this is Big Israel. And then America's Defense Line, I guess that means the Justice Department. No wonder we're screwed. But anyway, this thing is great. And I've listened to almost all of it already. And it's in chapters in podcast form. And it's really great. And it's about Isaiah Kenen and the origin of AIPAC. So first of all, what's AIPAC? And then second of all, who is Isaiah Kenen?
Yeah, so the founder of AIPAC, the America-Israel Public Affairs Committee, was Isaiah Kenen. And he has been written out of AIPAC history. I think it's important to mention, why are we kind of going back to the basics here? As a lot of people know, AIPAC has formed some political action committees. It used to help form PACs with very obscure names to pick and support candidates in regional races, but now they own a couple of their own PACs, Democratic Majority for Israel, United Democracy Project, and they pumped $24 million into various races to knock off, from our perspective, knock off candidates who won't be deferential to Israel's government. But most of the reporting on all of this lacks any historic basis. Like, what is AIPAC? When was it formed? Who formed it?
Well, even hold that thought for just 1 second, because I'm going to make that same mistake right now and stick with the current thing, which is that even though it's called AIPAC, it's not A-PAC, like Public Action Committee. That's just sort of a coincidence. It's the American, for some reason it's a silent I, because how the hell else are you going to pronounce it? But it's the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, not Public Action Committee. Public Affairs Committee, which is not a public action committee, but like, let's say I never heard of the regulations about these things. That's an important distinction. Only just now, this year, last year, they begun to erase that distinction, and AIPAC has gone ahead and created their own PACs.
Political action committees, correct. They formed a super PAC and a regular PAC.
Okay, so what does all this mean for somebody like, I mean, what's the difference that they can do now that they weren't doing before, for example?
Yeah, well, I mean, they used to signal to a giant group of PACs who they wanted to be favored, and they used to even issue some instructions to allegedly independent PACs about who to spend on. But what it means now is the coordination is much tighter. So they can do so-called independent spending just on ads against a candidate, and they can also contribute to the campaign of certain candidates. So what it means now is they're able to much more tightly coordinate their spending so it's more effective. It didn't used to always be effective, but now they've got, if you look at their political action super PAC spending, they've got a pollster, they've got a team to really look at how they can be most effective at knocking off any candidate who could be a potential threat and stand up to the Israeli government, call them out for their human rights abuses. That's what they don't want. So, this week, Andy Levin got taken out, Democrat from Michigan. They spent quite a bit to get him out of the picture because he was the worst possible threat. Somebody who was active in his synagogue, very progressive, but calling out Israel on, their treatment of Palestinians. He still voted for the aid. He still pretty much did everything every other Democrat does when it comes down to it. But he represented a vocal and sort of symbolic threat. And so they took him out. And so that's the big difference. Before they formed those political action committees, AIPAC could signal, it could put out a candidate scorecard, it could send secret memos like Elizabeth Schreier used to do when she was trying to coordinate a raft of PACs that AIPAC helped set up but didn't actually run. But now, this is their major program. As some people have indicated, and I believe this as well, they're ratcheting down spending on things like their giant conferences because this is so much more effective. Bringing in 15,000 people to the convention center in D.C. and having sort of a roll call of different elected officials to say how great Israel is and how it's the best thing in the world and has to get U.S. support. That's not as effective. The protests have grown too big, the infiltration by people holding up signs and saying, what about illegal settlements? They're not doing that anymore. So what they're doing is directly getting into primaries and elections. So that's a huge difference, the whole political action committee formation. They never had one of those in the drawer. Mm-hmm. Other things they've had in the drawer, the Near East Report, a lobbying newsletter that emerged directly from communications that used to be done directly by the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Israel Information Office, and that gets back to the history I want to talk about. And they've also had this so-called education wing, the American Israel Education Foundation, which is typically taken a third of all members of Congress who are going to an international destination. They've happened to take them to Israel, and they also finance the conference that they do every year or have done every year up until 2019 in Washington. So this is another couple of drawers they have in their H Street headquarters. A lot of these operations don't have any staff like the American Israel Education Foundation. They're really just paper conduits for directing funding from the mothership, which is the American Israel Public Affairs Committee.
Yeah. Now, so I think there was a real specific reason why they never had PACs before, right? Something about being able to say, we don't have PACs.
They used to thrive in saying, we are not a political action committee. We do not support candidates for office. We are strictly here to support the U.S.-Israel relationship, which is the framing they use to skirt their sordid past of being part of an umbrella that was ordered to register as an Israeli foreign agent. Because the bottom line is, and I go over this in depth in the podcast series, how Israel made AIPAC, they were set up with Israeli money. They were set up with Jewish agency money as well, which gets Israeli government funding. And it was coordinated with Israel. They saw Isaiah Kenen. He was taken around Congress people after getting a big aid package, one of Israel's first in the 1950s, the early 1950s. And he was casting about. He's like, should I be a diplomat for Israel? Should I return to my employment with the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs? And they're like, no, you got to go back to the U.S. and form, air quotes, American lobby for Israel. And that is exactly what he did. They were funneling cash to him. They were funding his newsletter, which was bombarding about 50,000 elites, as well as all members of Congress, telling what they should do in regard to Israel. and setting up this massive PR campaign with Madison Avenue to set the American mindset through magazines, the Saturday Evening Post, the New York Times radio station, funding a bunch of Israel, I'm just going to say propaganda, so that they would feel more favorably toward the Israelis and disregard any, pretense of fairness. So, AIPAC now, I think they're a lot weaker. The Democratic base that they have traditionally relied on for support is not pro-Israel to the extent that it used to be. It's better informed. And so it's kind of a sign of weakness that they've got to use, for example, recently $24 million that they could have used on something else, $24 million to knock out some of the voices that they know and have scored would have been critic from within Congress and possibly dragged other Democrats who, like the money and the support, but want to actually call out the Israelis for their treatment of children, prisoners, want to talk about the illegal settlements, want to talk about the constant military, harassment of Palestinians. And AIPAC just can't have that. So, the unfortunate thing, though, is the reporting on this has been terrible. And it all gets back to the lack of historical knowledge that most people venturing into this carefully have about what AIPAC is, why it was formed, when it was formed, and its history. Nobody troubles themselves to learn about anything like that, and there isn't a ton of information out there. But basically, some of the leading voices that are out there, like Robert Reich, want to say something like, well, this is a problem when corporations get into elections, and this is a problem, they're taking out these candidates because they're progressive. And that's BS. They don't really care that they're progressive. The only thing that matters to AIPAC, and the only thing that ever has mattered to AIPAC, is whether they're going to be compliant with what the Israeli government wants in terms of aid. And so if you take a very cynical sort of quantitative look, what's the value of an Andy Levin in Congress to AIPAC? Well, take the entire amount of foreign aid going to AIPAC this year, plus $1 billion subsidy for their Iron Dome missiles. And Andy Levin's seat is worth $9 million to the Israeli government.
Yeah.
And so if he took his first vote ever, and it would be his first vote ever, against the aid package, that would be unacceptable to Israel's government. Yeah. And he was never even close to being like that, but he was saying the wrong things. And so he had to go. And, people say, they took him out because he's progressive. No, they took him out because he represented a threat to that long-time subsidy. And they spent way less than $9 million to get him out of there. That was the value of his seat, and now it's going to go to a rubber stamp that Israel will like more.
Right.
That's the same with Donna Edwards. She, again, the amount they spent on her compared to what her seat was worth was, she was a bargain to get out of there and get the other person in.
Yeah. Well, look, in terms of having a unanimous House of Representatives that everybody just loves Israel and nobody has a thing to say about it, that's priceless if they can pull that off.
It is.
That they're pulling it off.
Is so, I think it has, a couple of effects. It makes it look normal. And if you look at the polls, and Gallup is pretty terrible on a lot of things, including this, but Pew is much better. The Democratic base is tired of this. They don't have representative leadership in Congress. They're tired of, aid that has it's completely, disconnected from any sort of responsibilities. It's unconditional. But to say that, it's all about progressives, no, that's not true. If Thomas Massey, for example, Republican from Kentucky, gets too much more up in AIPAC's grill about the Iron Dome extra missile subsidy like he did. He was tweeting out that when AIPAC was pushing back on him he was saying, hey, I'm being attacked by foreign agents. And that is exactly what was happening to him. But he can't do that too many more times or he'll be primaried as well. So he's kind of backed off on that. He did have a significant impact, I think, on helping to delay that. And if any senator ever looked like they might be in a position to put a hold on aid or asked about the Symington and Glenn Amendment restrictions on U.S. aid to foreign nuclear powers who aren't part of the NPT, they would go after Rand Paul, who's also, delayed aid to Israel. So that's the problem with all this sort of pseudo history about what's going on and where, what AIPAC does. That's the problem. Nobody realizes the implications and the very narrow focus of what AIPAC does. So, that's this 13-part series is a way to put up some extremely solid AIPAC history that's generally missing in the most, I would say, popular format for learning in bite-sized segments and, contextualize everything that's happened since before Israel was formed, how the lobbying began, what the leading thinkers putting together the lobby were dealing with in their own minds and their own words, and just going through, who was AIPAC's founder? When did they start lobbying for a country?
Well, go ahead. Tell us some stories, Grant.
Tell you some stories.
Yeah, tell us about Isaiah Kenen.
Yeah, so Isaiah Kenen was a really interesting guy because, I think he really adopted Theodore Herzl's entire plan, and he worked for all of the key organizations that helped bring Israel into existence and really saw it as something that was noble and that he was going to, as he said, in voice, pen, and deed, channeling Herzl, get on board with. So he started out, he was Canadian. He came to the U.S. His father was involved in trying to arm the Russian Tsar and get them some fuel cars, railroad stuff for their war, but they lost against, of course, the communists. So his father he lost a fortune fighting a dubious military adventure. Kenen was very much interested in becoming a journalist, and so he worked in Cleveland as a journalist, but he really got his start in lobbying for the organization of newspapermen and trying to get them some rights and really liked going to Washington and doing that. So he started off organizing. He didn't believe in petitions. He didn't believe in marches. And in that sense, he was right. What matters in Washington, D.C. is brute force and money. And so he was quickly noticed by Abba Hillel Silver and Abraham Feinberg, who were bigwigs in the Zionist movement. And they said, this guy's the guy. We need him. He was an advocate for the formation of Israel at the pre-state organization called the Jewish Agency. He went on study commission findings in the 40s to look at the situation in Palestine, and then was a UN spokesperson to lobby for the formation of Israel. He was on the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs payroll. He was on the Jewish Agency payroll. But they ran into problems with the IRS. They ran into problems with the U.S. because they're getting all their money from abroad. And so, as I mentioned earlier, he had to set up a nucleus of an organization in the U.S. that they could credibly say was an American, again, air quotes, lobby for Israel, and try to position it as a grassroots movement. And they had a very difficult time funding it. They had a very difficult time presenting it as anything like a grassroots movement. And they quickly ran into problems with Eisenhower, with Kennedy, they ran into problems because, senators were feeling the heat, feeling the pressure as they were putting out all of these propaganda statements that were really just basically Israeli government positions. And Senator J.W. Fulbright was angry about it. He wanted to know how they were being funded. He wanted to know why Isaiah Kenen stopped registering as an Israeli foreign agent with the Justice Department when he was essentially doing the same thing that the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Jewish Agency was paying him to do. And so there was a huge battle, which led to Kenen quickly fleeing the United States and going to Iran, which is a big Israeli ally at the time, and then visiting Africa while his organizations and network were being subpoenaed and documents were being seized, and there were hearings in the Senate, and there was a registration order issued by the Justice Department. So, Kenen survived into the mid-'70s, and they managed to get through all of these calls for accountability because, they were providing the one thing that American politicians need most. As Abraham Feinberg, who is, again, this big Democratic Party fundraiser, said, kind of like Haim Saban today, he was a one-issue guy, and his issue was Israel, and he was getting all sorts of funding from Israel, like for a Coca-Cola bottling plant later, and he was very much involved in all sorts of financial transactions. But he was determined to make sure that American politicians got enough money that they would ignore virtually everything Israel was doing in the United States, whether it was the nuclear weapons program, which Feinberg helped fund by funding all sorts of organizations in Israel, or, this stealth lobbying campaign.
Hang on just one second. Hey, y'all, they've got great deals on weed at thehempspot.com. The Hemp Spot specializes in Delta-8 tetrahydrocannabinol instead of Delta-9, so they can send it straight to you anywhere in America. Recently, a friend moved and didn't have a guy in his new town, but then he heard about the hempspot.com on my show and was saved, figuratively and literally, because if you use the promo code Scott, you get 15% off every order and free shipping on any order over $100. Legal jams, bud, gummies, and the rest in your state. Thehempspot.com. Spell the THC. You guys, my friend Mike Swanson has written such a great revisionist take on the early history of the post-World War II national security state and military-industrial complex in the Truman, Eisenhower, and Kennedy years. It's called The War State. I have to say, it's the most convincing case I've read that Kennedy had truly decided to end the Cold War before he was killed. In any case, I know you'll love it. The War State by Mike Swanson.
So they, his quote was, I provided them with the money or with what they needed, which was campaign contributions. He did a audio interview at the Truman Library about that. Harry S. Truman was basically putty in the hands of Feinberg and the organizations of proto-AIPAC. I mean, he reluctantly recognized the state of Israel over the objections of his state and war departments. He was very tepid in revising the statement of recognition. He really resented the pressure that was being put on him. But right after recognition, he quickly went to the same people pressuring him to organize his whistle stop campaign. And, you see that picture in your mind of Dewey beats Truman. He wouldn't have won election if he hadn't tapped the forces that were pressuring him to recognize Israel and then send gobs of foreign aid their way. So it's a really interesting story of the first, I would say, purchase of an American politician, which was certainly Truman, that nobody talks about anymore. You would think that there would be one article about the Truman whistle stop campaign in the context of everything that's being written today about this tragedy of progressive Democrats being knocked off by AIPAC. Mm-hmm. But again, there's no historical knowledge. There's no willingness to go there.
Well, in fact, I mean, they have an opportunity here, right? Because famously, well, in some circles anyway, but importantly, this scholar, John Judas, published a book about this, the Israel lobby's, kind of their role in that Truman campaign. And their founding and their influence on him and his recognition of Israel and all that. Just within the last 5-6 years, something like that, right?
Yeah. Yeah, he did.
So
he
it's
wrote
institutional knowledge among some people anyway,
Well, it should be in every article, though. I mean, really, any article about AIPAC should go back to Abraham Feinberg, the Whistle Stop campaign at Truman, and then talk about the fact that this went on, same guy, same millions right into the LBJ administration. And, it should be, it shouldn't be the occasional book. It should definitely be it should be in the context behind every news article that talks about this. And so you're talking about Genesis, Truman, America Jews, and the origins of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Publisher was the same one that published the Israel Lobby that Walton Mearsheimer wrote. It came out in 2014, as far as I remember, but one book is not going to be enough. And I just, I think that everyone's been dropping the ball, because the place that nobody wants to go as a journalist right now, whether they're, talking about the policy or talking about what AIPAC is doing right now, they don't want to get outside the Overton window. And, the Overton, the fringes of that Overton window are, there's been a lot of foreign influence to set this whole thing up from the beginning. And you can't just say, oh, it seems like now most of the people funding this are American. It was set up with foreign money. It was set up with foreign objectives. Again, securing U.S. arms and aid to Israel. It's something the Israeli government needed. It wasn't something the United States needed. There's never been a sound argument saying that the U.S. really needed to set up a new alleged ally in this particularly sensitive part of the Middle East. But, nobody can go there. And so you've got this hand-wringing about AIPAC is targeting progressives.
Yeah, which is funny, right? Because they're just replacing progressive or, liberal Democrats with liberal Democrats. It's just this one issue. Thinking in one race, it was like, we'll replace the black lady with the black lady.
And Nancy Pelosi has come out recently. I think she's kind of on her last legs here, so she feels like she can do it. But she's come out in support of J Street's platform, which, is not terribly different than AIPAC.
Did she actually say that? I mean, was that recently?
She's called out AIPAC for doing what it did to Donna Edwards. And she did that within the context, of a J Street sort of plug. But, it's not something she's ever done as a young congressperson. So I kind of view it as maybe throwing a bone to the squad and some of the progressives in her orbit. But, it's AIPAC and the Israel lobby is so vital to Democratic Party fundraising. They're in a real tight spot. J Street, which was set up much more recently than AIPAC was, has a position that it's more progressive. It talks about the long dead two-state solution. It's against illegal settlement in the West Bank. And they're sort of heralded as this great progressive force, but there's still lobby. They spend the majority of their budget, as far as I can tell, in congressional clerk filings, lobbying for arms, just like AIPAC does, and inserting Israel into everything, every major program in the U.S. to kind of give them an edge in terms of development and other opportunities. So, it's a very mild thing. What the Democratic Party cannot do is begin to put in any party platform saying we oppose settlements, we're going to condition foreign aid, we will no longer allow a blank check for Israel's treatment of child prisoners, which is a big Betty McCollum program. They can't do that because they need the funding. One of the heads of Emily's List was on a panel, and she talked about how they're basically going to Israel lobby donors for every major campaign startup, and that's where they're getting their startup money. It's a great little clip that just continues to talk about how important this is. So you're not going to see any Democrats talking about how AIPAC is destroying the Democratic Party. They're going to either try to stay quiet or talk about money in politics and Citizens United and the intervention of corporations, which, is not really an issue. There's nothing out there in the world of politics that isn't a corporation. I mean, you can rail against a corporation all you want, but it's the first thing everybody forms when they want to get into this business. And so too with the whole idea that United Democracy Project, one of the PACs and Democratic Majority for Israel, about 90% of the reporting you see out there and the tweets is, oh, hey, they're attacking candidates without mentioning Israel in their attacks, and all they care about is Israel. Well, I mean, everybody does that in Washington. Everybody does Oppo research, and they attack politicians based on their weaknesses. And, Americans for Freedom or Americans for Socialism, they don't talk about, what their program is. They talk about this candidate and why they're so terrible. And it's because they did this when they're 20 years old or that, last week. But they never really, when they're in a campaign mode, they never really mention their principles. And so that's why it's so necessary, I think, for everybody to put on their Bose headphones or whatever it is they use and listen to every single one of these episodes. We've put out 7 episodes of how Israel made AIPAC. And the exciting ones, I got to say, are the ones that are in the bag. And, the most updates and interesting podcast is going to be the final one. But, get up to date on the importance of the Israeli government in the formation of AIPAC, the battle they had with the Department of Justice. And by the way, to your question, the reason the original book that came out on the research of the big document FOIA that we got from the Justice Department showing how they completely fell on their faces in trying to regulate AIPAC, the name of that book was America's Defense Line. And it's because it had so much content and reference to Isaiah Kenen's book, Israel's Defense Line. So he saw the U.S. as kind of this giant, malleable, weapon that could be pointed at all of Israel's enemies. And, America's Defense Line, unfortunately, was not as well funded. It didn't have the leadership backbone that it should have. But that was definitely the Justice Department FARA division, which has reverted now to exclusively going after, small state official enemies. It's not really upholding its mandate. It's gotten weaker and weaker. But it is good to see all of the manipulation and behind the scenes politicking that went into overturning within the Justice Department, overturning the only resistance that they had to this massive propaganda and foreign funded adventure called the formation of AIPAC. So I've gotten a couple of really interesting notes, and this is partially what led to the creation of this series from historians who are saying, hey, why isn't there audio of this out there? This is so great. And, it's overdue. It's going to be out there forever. It's going to be an audio reference manual. And once it's done, I just hope that people find it to be as useful as kind of a standalone, hey, I can access this in bite size or binge the whole thing, but really get the perspective that isn't out there right now.
Yeah. Look, it's so important that, I'm sorry, it's just a simple turn of phrase in a way almost, right, Grant? That, hey, these are just concerned Americans. No, right. They're not. It's a lobby set up in the interests of a foreign government by that foreign government, no different than if we were talking about the Turks or this or that or whatever. Right. And, I saw an Israel lobby type guy whose name you would recognize on the Twitter there saying, ha to all the anti-Semites who are mad that these anti-Israel candidates lost, including Andy Levin, the Jewish Zionist who was just mildly critical, had just said a few things, but, that was worth all the millions of dollars in the world.
Absolutely.
To get rid of a guy like that who would even just disrupt the narrative at all. And you're an anti-Semite if you're a partisan of Mr. Levin in this case, too. Yeah. But on the other hand, I mean, it's just okay. So I guess the point is, they're still playing that same stupid game. But on the other hand, like, how ridiculous is that? That partisans of this progressive black female congressman and this white Jewish man Zionist congressman, that these people are, they're the radical right, the Aryan nations and all this kind of thing.
It doesn't stand up. I mean, I do think it's being noticed, that sort of gloating and that sort of, celebratory lap. And they didn't manage to take out Rashida Tlaib, who is a vocal Palestinian. They really probably couldn't. I mean, she would be an example of, they could spend the $9 million that her seat is worth, but they're not going to take it back. She's got too much grassroots support. And I think, their polling and their dial testing indicates that she couldn't be taken out in a primary. So, they're not wasting money, and they're not throwing money into losing races. And that's another reason for AIPAC to form a PAC. Before trying to coordinate NORPAC and some of the other stealth Israel lobbies that had very obscure names, it was very difficult, and they weren't supposed to do it. So, it was a real chore to try to take people out. They had to engage in things like, they call them spoiler candidates. They ran Ed Valens in California so they could get a rubber stamp into office over there, and the AIPAC directors were in charge of that. But they had a difficult time. Campaign finance laws were a lot tighter in the 80s and 90s. And so this represents, I think, just major inroads in campaign finance. And I honestly think they're going to be spending so much money and tapping their donors so much that probably not going to see things like conferences in the near future. I think they're going to be tapped out spending on races. But another good thing that's happening is, at least for the PAC, is that you can see who's funding AIPAC. And one of their strengths has been donor secrecy when they were just, doing the 501c4 thing. Now, at least the ones that are giving to candidates, there have to be public disclosures of who's funding them. And I think they're setting themselves up for a bit more backlash from the boycott community, who's not going to want to buy products, to the extent that some are connected with products and service companies, not going to want to help those donors keep pumping money in. I see that one of the people who was a founder of WhatsApp has been identified now as giving $2 million. Of course, he doesn't own it anymore. He sold it, but it's always healthy, I think, for people to have a little bit more transparency in who's funding all of this. But the biggest thing here is really who set up AIPAC, who funded it, who really organized it to be the so-called American lobby for Israel. People got to know that history. They've got to understand that history. They've got to see how there's a gigantic fail in terms of applying any sort of law, and that now we're stuck with this. So there is some hope, though. Hope in the 13th episode, and really excited by the feedback that I've gotten so far.
Great. Yeah, I love it, man. I'm on episode, 4 or 5 now. And
awesome.
I've been listening to a lot. I think it's really great. And, I don't know, man. I'm just pretending. But, like, if I was new here, I might be, I don't know, not surprised, but shocked that foreign governments are allowed, whether they have a stamp from FARA or not, that they're allowed to lobby the American people in the Congress in this way at all. If you're a foreign sovereign nation, you can talk to the State Department. Other than that, F off.
Yeah.
What the hell are they doing? This is insane. And you see how far out of control it is now where, Ben Freeman, who I don't think I'm going to have today, but I was trying to arrange to interview today, has a thing still about the right wing, what we used to call the China lobby, the Taiwan lobby.
Yep.
And their role in getting, everybody wondered, why is Pelosi doing this? She has her own foreign policy that, Biden doesn't want her to go. She goes to Taiwan anyway. And then the answer was, guess what? Is Dick Gephardt and Tom Daschle are lobbyists for the Taiwanese Hawks. And so they were the ones who had, it was all just about money. The whole thing is, the flea wagging the dog. And just think where, and Ben Freeman has agreed about this, whether we're talking about Ukraine, whether we're talking about Saudi Arabia or Israel or Turkey, or probably England too, that these nations have far more influence on American foreign policy than the American people have. In fact, we have none at all compared to them. And we're nobody compared to them when they should, again, have an ambassador. And that's it.
Right.
According to, at least, if I'm saying like all other things being equal, I just got here and things, it was a normal functioning constitutional republic. Isn't that the way it would be?
It would. It would indeed. I mean, I hate to keep going back to the oligarchy report, but the American voter has remarkably little influence on any U.S. policy. If you divide it up into tranches and look at what they want compared to what's actually implemented, it's all the special interest groups and big funders. And the average American has close to zero influence on any policy. But Freeman's work, I mean, incredible stuff. $175 million going into think tanks between 2014 and 2018. Absolutely right. I think it's, By
the way, that is such chump change. We're talking about foreign sovereign governments with billion-dollar budgets. It's the same as Lockheed that makes literally tens of billion, always north of 50, well, at least north of 40 a year. Tens of billions of dollars off of the Pentagon. And then they spend a measly couple of 10 million financing a few think tanks. Give me a break.
But look what you can do and what I can do with much less. I mean, for a think tank, it's a significant amount of money.
Sure. Exactly. Like that's the whole point, right?
They wouldn't know what to do with 100 million. There'd be no one left to buy. I mean,
yeah, it's amazing. A couple of steak dinners will do you. Yeah,
right. There's a certain diminishing return, and even and of course, like you say, this stuff, as long as you disclose it to the Foreign Agents Registration Act office, it's legal. You can, as a foreign government, you can hire Americans for Ukraine and you can set up an operation, but you got to file, how much you're paying and who you're paying, and you got to file what you're saying, and it's got to be transparent. And of course, the magic of running a really good foreign influence campaign, I would say AIPAC mastered it, is getting out of that registration vice. I mean, there's nothing that Isaiah Kenen, AIPAC founder, resented more than filing Foreign Agent Registration Act reports. He hated it, and he always filed the minimum, and he was constantly conspiring openly how to get out of that transparency initiative. And, the 8.5 million got her pumped into think tanks. If they could, pumping it into Brookings, if they could, they wouldn't want to disclose that because they want any benefit they get or any program that Brookings is launching to be positioned as this is what's best for America. And, oftentimes it's the worst thing for America. And it's going to cost veterans. It's going to cost taxpayers. It's going to be a disaster. It's going to go against the U.S.'s mild progress on any sort of justice and reforms. And so they don't want that. They want to be able to pump money into these operations and have it be positioned as completely domestic, completely something that came out of the U.S. So, yeah, it's transparency is good. Unfortunately, this is legal, but AIPAC is really the case study on how a foreign influence operation got legs and basically destroyed any semblance of oversight and compliance with the law, and nobody knows about it.
Yeah. Well, they do now, and they can now. America's defense line, Divert, Spy Trade, and Big Israel. And now and Foreign Agents and Deadly Dogma. Grant's great books all on Amazon for you there. And then this great podcast series is called How Israel Made AIPAC. And you can find it at howisraelmadeaipac.podbean.com.
Should also find it on Spotify, Amazon, iHeartRadio, Apple, and Google soon. And hate to compete with you, Scott. You're the podcast master.
Hey, man, you're doing great. This is great work as always, just like your writing. Well, it is your writing, only out loud. And
there you go.
So, it's wonderful. And I hope everyone will check it out again. How Israel Made AIPAC, and it'll be in the show notes at the bottom of this interview at scotthorton.org and the Libertarian Institute, etc. like that. So thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
The Scott Horton Show, Anti-War Radio, can be heard on KPFK 90.7 FM in LA, APSradio.com, antiwar.com, scotthorton.org, and libertarianinstitute.org.